Should a doctor prescribe poetry writing or visiting an art gallery as an alternative for medication? Medical professionals are doing so in a range of countries. The benefits of creative and community activity for health and well-being are increasingly being recognised globally. Could this be the case where Western medicine is catching up with practices First Nations communities have enacted for millennia? How are health and well-being impacted by creative art? The episode you're about to listen to was presented as part of the Poetry on Prescription Healing Through the Arts Symposium, a collaboration between the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research and the Health Research Institute at the University of Canberra. This two-day symposium brought together artists, health practitioners, and end users to learn more about the relationship between creative art and well-being, with a special focus on poetry. It was held at the University of Canberra over the 22nd and 23rd of November 2024.
Colleagues, welcome back. Dr. Vic McEwan is an artist. You already know about him from Lachlan's talk. He's an artistic director and a researcher. He works in collaboration with diverse non-arts partners, which is a bold move, a courageous move, to explore complex and often difficult themes using sound and video and photography, installation and performance. Like, he's bigger than Ben-Hur, really. His artistic endeavours have outcomes have toured venues such as the National Museum of Australia and the Tate Liverpool, which is very cool. These include the harmonic oscillator, which investigates the adverse effects of noise in hospital environments. I think we can probably all relate to that. And Face to Face, the new normal, developed in partnership with the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic. So he's on a whole lot of boards and important things. And what we really are passionate about, where he's concerned, is that in 2023, he became the first artist to complete an arts-led PhD from the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And that's really some huge achievement. So please welcome Vic.
Thanks very much for having me. I feel like I've had two introductions today now from both Lachlan and yourself, so that's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm a visitor here from Wiradjuri country in Narrandera, a few hours down the highway, but I also spend a lot of my time travelling to Sydney, so I'm often on the Hume, and travelling to a lot of other places. I'm here just now. On Monday I'll be in Broken Hill and Menindee for a week, working with community there. And a lot of this sort of travel that I do is all because of my artistic practice, that is trying to sort of place myself into the context of people and place, and to sort of understand the role that the arts can play in these sort of contexts. I have to time my talk because I'm inspired by the post-qualitative researcher St. Pierre, who talks about using writing as a form of inquiry. I often like to use giving presentations as my own form of inquiry to understand my thinking, where things are at, where all these bits of evidence and things that I'm collecting actually mean. And so I need to time myself because I'm going to go on a journey. I've prepared a 13 or 14 hour presentation here, and I'm just going to jump around in a choose your own adventure style for myself, depending on how this sort of feels as we go. And so, you know, most of my artistic practice, my career for the last kind of 15 years has been trying to push artistic practice into new areas. And so that means that my practice is partnership focused, and especially with non-arts partners, so such as health, river management, science, trying to understand what bringing the knowledge system of artistic processes, not just artistic outcomes, but their processes, can sort of achieve in coming into relationship with other types of knowledge systems. And so I'm also the artistic director of an arts organisation called the CAD Factory. We're an artist-led organisation where we have charity status, and predominantly and more we talk about socially engaged arts practice. We talk about the role that the arts can play out navigating some of the complexities of our world in a form of making that we like to use the term socially engaged art practice. And so, you know, one of the things I like about the term socially engaged practice, or one of the things I like about socially engaged art, is that it's hard to define. It has many different definitions. And so, really, it's not really the definition of socially engaged arts practice that I find interesting, but exploring some of its qualities. What are the things that make up socially engaged practice? And so some of the ways I think about this form of making is that it's a type of practice that brings the artist out of their typical artist studio into engagement with the lives of other people and the lives of other things. And so the result of that means that for me, socially engaged practice is around the navigation between aesthetics, and aesthetics meaning for myself a sort of a navigation of any creative endeavour. It could be just as appropriate for sound and music as it could for visual arts. It's a bringing together of the aesthetics with ethics. So how, when we're forming these new type of relationships through contemporary arts practice, we navigate the ethics of placing our work in relationship or in entanglement with the lives of other people. And so another way that I like to think about socially engaged practice is that it's a type of work that either reveals and or responds to a vulnerable world in need of care. And so I see socially engaged practice as a form of care. How can I enact care through my artistic practice while also satisfying my own artistic desires? And so this coming together of these two things is one of the keys to some of the complications around the navigation of this kind of work. We recently have signed a contract with Routledge to write what we think is the first philosophy of socially engaged arts practice. And so that manuscript is due any day now. And so really what that's doing is sort of making some claims around, people have been trying to develop frameworks for socially engaged practice, which is, a fabulous endeavour. But what we're saying in our philosophy of socially engaged practice is that in a type of practice that is so relational that you don't know what's going to happen, and actually your skill that you need to develop is how to respond to that relationality. That a framework, what do we do when the contours of that framework, when things go so off script that we're no longer within the confines of a workable framework in a way that we expected? And we argue that, it's through understanding some philosophies of practice, why and how and what are the qualities, that are a useful sort of tool for an artist to help navigate some of these things that they necessarily don't expect but might be confronted by. And so I am often, the term arts and health has come up today, and what the meaning of that is. I sit on the Arts and Health New South Wales and ACT leadership group, and have been a part of that group for about 7 or 8 years, I think. But I generally don't adopt the term arts and health for myself, for my own practice. I prefer to use the term socially engaged arts practice. And I think where I position the concept of arts and health is as a type of socially engaged practice. And so I think of, fields of practice like arts and health or creative recovery of being types of socially engaged art making. I also think socially engaged art making is a type of socially engaged art making. So in my PhD, which has been sort of mentioned today, I was the first artist to be enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine and Health as a contemporary experimental artist, so not as an arts therapist. There were several sort of key complications in the way that I wanted to approach that. One was that at the very beginning, my whole PhD question at the beginning was, what would happen if a contemporary experimental artist entered a medical clinic with no roadmap for their artistic practice and responded to the clinical experience? And so that, of course, brought up many complications, such as how do you get ethical approval for such a thing? I, of course, had to get ethical approval from both the university and the local health district. And I have this great email that I've kept as a souvenir that talked about when it first went to the ethics committee, came back saying the ethics committee is really excited about this notion of an undefined, open-ended practice and the benefits it can have to the clinic. Could you just please define it for us? So I realised at that sort of point that this is going to be a PhD that might require many modifications as we go along. But But in my mind, that was all part of the journey too, because I realised quite a long time ago that the idea of, for example, convincing a medical faculty to allow me to enrol, the idea of pushing the sort of boundaries of what an ethical committee might deem sort of safe and ethical is actually part of my artistic practice. I don't consider it to be the sort of things that I need to put in place in order to practice. Part of that sort of sculpting and manoeuvring and pushing the world in a way is a part of, I think, the sort of art making that I'm doing. It's all part of the process of me creating work. And so in making the decision to enrol in the Faculty of Medicine, I initially was going to enrol in the arts and maybe have a medical supervisor on my panel. I still wanted to do the same work in the facial nerve clinic, which I'll explain in a moment. But the reason I undertook a PhD was because I wanted to critique my practice, or I wanted others to critique my practice. I had for many years been making these claims about the potential for contemporary arts to speak to multiple perspectives at one time. So with one voice through the arts, speak to different viewpoints on things, which is why I like to place my practice in points of contention or trauma or difficulty, because I believe there is a process or a methodology through the arts in which we can hold all of these perspectives and actually hold them and understand as a starting point that the differences between these perspectives are the places of value. These are the places that we need to sit in order to move through them. And so, I believe in the ability of contemporary arts to do some of that manoeuvring. And so I thought, even though I felt I could look to a lot of evidence in my past practice to support this claim, I thought, what better way than to place my enrolment in a Faculty of Medicine where people are going to say things to me like they did say, like, what the hell are you doing here? Why is this person here? And so I assembled a supervisory team that included somebody from clinical medicine, so they were my primary supervisor, also somebody from the medical humanities, so from Sydney Health Ethics, so around the ethics of medicine, and somebody from the Department of Performance Studies. And it was intriguing sort of bringing together of people. We would every now and then have what we lovingly termed supervisory summits, where I would send them some draft writing or some draft ideas and we'd get together in a room for an hour, talk it through. And in some of those meetings, they were often, although always really beneficial, but I would have encounters where in the same meeting around the same piece of writing, I was being told, that's fabulous, keep going, or that's a dead end, that's of no interest and that's actually not valid, move away from it. And so I was being told really different perspectives. And then, a really great comment from one of my supervisors, which was, Vic, you invited us to be here, so you need to work out how you're going to navigate our different perspectives here. And so that became a really kind of important part of the journey as well. In addition to that, I also requested that my two examiners of my PhD would be from different disciplines. And so I requested that they sought an examiner from clinical medicine and one from the arts. And so as it eventuated, one of my examiners was a facial nerve surgeon, an international surgeon, somebody I haven't come across, and the other being an arts academic from UNSW. And so again, to really test that idea that with one thesis and one for the first time ever, Sydney University medical faculty having to examine an exhibition of artworks, which they'd never done before, really sort of put myself to the test to see if I could have both disciplines pass this through examination. And so I'd been quite prepared for many months of sort of back and forth and rewriting as I was trying to navigate some of the comments that might come back after submission, but luckily passed with no changes required from either discipline. And so, thank you very much, thank you. Which is a really exciting development in my mind, because it's this idea that this notion that the arts can speak to multiple disciplines at the same time has been proven. And so, I have that sort of that recognition that is an idea that is valid. My thesis then went on to win both the Faculty of Medicine and Health's Outstanding Thesis Award, which again is astonishing in that faculty decided to give that award to an artist. And it also won the Council of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences 2023 Australian Distinctive Work Prize. And so again, that cross-disciplinary recognition, which was really my aim, has really been the basis of my practice for more than 15 years about how to sort of do this cross-disciplinary navigation. And then just to say, well, again, it's proven, and now we can move on and learn deeper ways to work in this kind of way. As Lachlan sort of touched on, that idea of showing works of this nature in that exhibition that you saw little parts of, there is an idea of a sense of care for also visitors that come to this sort of work. So how do we care for visitors in that gallery space where in the 15 artworks that we saw snippets of 2 of them, in the 15 artworks that were shown there was some tough stuff in there, and how do we care for audiences that come there? And so we had employed in that exhibition what we called cultural mediators, and they were people that employed to be in the gallery, not in a front of house role, and in a very open, undefined role of just being there, to observe people and to get a sense of, that person seems approachable, I might just go and say hello, and see what sort of conversation unfolds. And what came out of that sort of cultural mediation process was, understanding this role that having other human beings in that space to just sort of tend to and nurture some of the complex responses that people might have to that work became a really valuable sort of asset or resource for the emotional navigation of audiences as they came into that space. And so I've done a whole range of other arts and health work. As was mentioned, I spent time in the UK at Alderhay Children's Hospital in Liverpool with the work The Harmonic Oscillator that spoke to, or that explored the impacts of sound in hospital spaces. It looked at all the medical research that told us that sound levels are not only causing things such as an increase in medication for patients, a lack of sleep, increased stress. And so, the idea there at the time, which was a project that ended up going for 4 years, and in 2014 I started, and because at the time there was no way that an artist in Australia could get the sort of access into medical spaces that I was able to get at that time in the UK. And so I had an NHS pass that deemed me to be artist, and I was able to work in intensive care and to work in various wards with people for 4 years, where I'd travel to the UK once or twice a year. And that, I could very easily give a very long talk, as I've done many times, about that work. But one of the sort of richnesses that, one of the sort of real life-changing things that happened from that project was the creation of a work with a young teenage patient by the name of Alicia. And you'll notice throughout all of the work and through what Lachlan shared earlier that, in these processes I've repeatedly received ethical permission to use the participants' names that I work with to sort of identify them as people through their medical journey. And that's been the decision of those patients that I've worked with, not a decision of my own, and a decision that they can change at any point. Even now, for some of them that I've maintained relationships, they could contact me and say, could you stop using my name when you talk about that work, for example? And so this patient, Alicia, who was 17 years old and was brought into hospital, it was unknown to her that she was ill, and she collapsed one day in assembly at school. And she was brought into hospital, and it was discovered that she had multiple cancers and they'd damaged her spine to the point where she actually never walked again from not knowing she was ill. And several people came up to me in Alderhay, which is a massive hospital, serves a really large area, including Wales. Several people came up to me and said, Vic, there's a new patient here called Alicia who I think you should meet. When she was rushed into hospital, the one thing she grabbed was her art journals. And so she was a young 17-year-old aspiring artist. And so when I went and met her, we made a decision after several visits to just work together to try to collaborate as equally as we could, given the differences in our circumstance. So instead of what I might do with other patients, where I might go and do a workshop with them and explore sound in the hospital, we just decided to make work together. And in that sort of long relationship we developed over the next year or so, we started talking about internal body sounds and what they mean. And so I taught her mother how to use a stethoscope, which I'd got that had an output so I could record internal body sounds. And I left it with Alicia's mother, and they recorded recordings of her heartbeat over several nights when I wasn't there. At the same time, I was researching places around the world that have really interesting acoustic phenomena, because sound is one of the areas that I'm interested in. And I discovered a place in the north of Scotland, up in the Highlands past Inverness, where there is a place on earth where sound lasts longer than anywhere else. And so in this place, it's in some oil tanks which were built inside the Highlands in secret in between World War I and World War II to store oil for the British Navy in case the Navy's supply of oil was bombed. And so this is now privately owned land. There's no longer oil in these tanks. But this discovery that happened, it was only 10 or 15 years ago. Up until this point, the longest sound on Earth was 45 seconds, or the space where sound lasted the longest was 45 seconds. So if you clapped your hands, that sound wouldn't repeat for 45 seconds. That sound in itself would be extended, and it would take you 45 seconds to hear it. So the acoustic phenomena that was discovered in these oil tanks was that sound lasted for 2 minutes. So if I said hello, that in a really complex way, that hello would take you 2 minutes to hear within that space. And so I started thinking, at that point, Alicia, unfortunately, had just entered palliative care. And so we started talking about what would it mean to take the heartbeat of someone whose heart didn't have long left to beat and to replay it in a space where sound lasted longer than anywhere else in the world. And so we had conversations first with the hospital about, is that ethical? Which is a conversation that happens once every 3 to 4 minutes over the last 15 years of my life. And then there was conversations with Alicia where she was so wildly excited and in her Welsh accent would say, I'm going to have the longest heartbeat in history. I don't know if that was Welsh, but really, really excited by the concept. And so, of course, she couldn't travel up to this place, but I did with Clive Parkinson, who's from Manchester Metropolitan Uni and arts and health advocate and a dear friend. And we travelled to this place and we were pushed through a tube that was just wide enough for us to fit, to fall into this dark, pitch black oil tank where we then spent hours playing Alicia's heartbeat, so a single just boom, boom. But hearing that for 2 minutes play out and re-recording it, playing long runs of her heart beating and just letting that sound build up. As Clive said, the sound was like hearing diamonds, was how he described that sound. And so we had this beautiful, astonishing sound piece. So one way to think about it is a sound artwork is what we had. Another way to think about it is a young girl's heartbeat who's just entered palliative care extended to 2 minutes long. It was a sound that had texture. It had all these qualities that we don't usually think about with sound. An elderly farmer, a relative of the farmer's, walked in, who had been outside the whole time, and he said he could hear the heartbeat outside. And in his own words said, the wee lassie's heartbeat is embodying the Highlands. And so then that was done at the end of a trip. And, my arrangement with Alicia was that I was coming back to the UK in 3 months and that she would still be in hospital. And so we would then spend time together thinking, what do we do with this beautiful sound? So I travelled home, and then it was only the next week where I received an email from her mother telling me she had passed away unexpectedly. So she never got to hear the heartbeat. And so I phoned Clive over in Manchester and I was saying, don't know what to do. Should I email the mum and say, do you want to hear the heartbeat? And so we decided after many conversations that would be the best decision. We talked about things like, well, it might be best to send it in the morning, UK time, in case it troubles her, so she can go out, engage in the day rather than be late at night, kept up on her own potentially. So all of these sort of navigations of the ethics of how to approach every step of this. She was really happy to receive the recording of Alicia's 2-minute heartbeat, and it became the sort of beginning of an ongoing, I think since then I've been to the UK 12 or 15 times, and maybe 9 of those times have seen her. And so we then exhibited that as work at the Tate Liverpool as part of a bigger exhibition of work from Alder Hey. And, again, part of that navigation was about, even the night before we opened to the public in the Tate, speaking to Alicia's mum saying, are you sure you're comfortable with this being in the exhibition? Knowing that if she said no, I would have to pull it out. I would have to then think this whole sort of centrepiece of this exhibition at quite a major art institution, I would have to withdraw without any question. But writing that, it became, this artwork in this example became something that as an artist was quite profound for me. But it also became a place where the family could talk and think and feel through their grief. And we could talk through the concept of grief and what role the arts might play in navigating that. And so, you know, that project for me was really kind of life-changing in terms of thinking, my God, this is what I can feel through the arts. When I showed that work at the Tate Liverpool, I'd sometimes spend the days just without anybody knowing, just watching everybody all day from the minute it opened to it shut, engage with the work. And there was one day where a man sat down and there was a video playing about the work and about going into the oil tank. It told the story, and then you could listen to the 2-minute heartbeat. And after he did all that, he sat there just crying. And so I went and spoke to him, and he was just telling me about how he felt. And the whole time I was, as I continually do, thinking, is it too much? Is this the right sort of thing to do? Is it ethical to show this sort of work? Is it too, well, could it push people, you know, somewhere too much? And then he said to me, this is what art should do. It should make me feel this much. And so this sort of became a really, important part of my practice in terms of thinking about the potential of what we can feel through this sort of making. And so I just spent far too long. I wasn't expecting to go down the track of Alicia's heartbeat, but once I start, it's hard to stop. So this sort of idea about the role of the arts has had a lot of sort of play out in clinical spaces for me, but also not in clinical spaces. So on rivers, on the Murrumbidgee River, after the Menindee fish kill events of 2019 and 2023. So you might recall that in 2019, overnight 1 million dead fish appeared on the Barker-Darling River in Menindee. And then in 2023, 30 million dead fish appeared on the river. So we delivered a project that's actually still ongoing that brought together Barkindji elders, Wiradjuri elders and young Wiradjuri men and the Department of Primary Industries to try to bring together art, science and ancient knowledges to try to understand how do we navigate these sorts of traumas and how do we navigate them through different sort of knowledge systems. And I'm just going to play a little short, it's like 1.5 minute video of just a snippet of the last fish kill events. In 2019, it was a really major story in the news. In 2023, the broadcasting of the fish kill events was much less than in 2019. But in 2023, there was 30 million dead fish. It was 30 times. Those fish are the totems of the Barkindji people. Barkindji means of the river. The Barkindji people say they are of the river. The river is their ancestors. The river is them. Here is the river so sick that their totem is lying dead in the numbers up to 30 million. And so that as a, without being in Menindee and sort of experiencing that, it's hard. So this is just a 1.5 minute video.
At this point, a video was played that will not translate well into the podcast format. The presentation resumed as follows.
Nobody had been trained in how to remove 30 million dead fish from a river, so there was no system in place. As these fish became swollen with water and just sunk or stunk, so people spoke about the smell from the river. This river is also the water source for that region. So this is also practically a health issue because, there's videos and news footage of people lifting up their shirts and their body covered in kind of welts because they drank this water. So apart from the conversations about the connection between culture and health, for example, very direct health-related issues as a response to the fact that their water source, in this instance, had 30 million dead fish on it. And so again, this is an idea of sort of understanding what role can play. One of the many, many results of this work has been, in the last few months, the Chief Scientist's Office being in contact with us as in their own words, talking about how they can learn from what we learned from undertaking these creative processes as a response to the 2019 and 23 fish kill events. So as a part of our process, we made shows on both the Murrumbidgee and the Barker River with community that explored some of these concepts, but also explored concepts such as care. How do we care for each other through these kind of difficult and tricky scenarios? And you'll see here, even when the density of fish breaks up ahead and around the bend, it's just as thick as again. On Monday, I'll be back in Menindee with community for the week, together looking at some of the interventions that the government are talking about trying to do on that river, specifically at the moment around fish travel. And so one of the many reasons for the fish kill events happening one of the outcomes was that the fish that were still alive weren't able to get certain places, which would have alleviated some of the problems. We'll be back up there next week, sort of trying to understand some of that. And so, in trying to understand this as a form of art making, I've spent so many years working with other sectors trying to push their thinking in terms of accepting the arts. And what I've been thinking about, or what I've been experiencing through a number of experiences in the last kind of 6 months, is actually so much work needs to be done in the arts. So much work needs to be done in the arts about how do we do this navigation between aesthetics, if that's a word you want to use, and ethics. How do we place the intent of the artist, their ego perhaps, in the ethics of the lives and or traumas of other people? And how do we sort of navigate that? Apart from some of the old traditions of devaluing community engaged work, socially engaged work, and viewing it as a lesser type of art making. And so a lot of my thinking at the moment is about this concept of how we push the arts. Bruno Latour, in his publication that has a long title of Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? From Matters of Fact to Matters of Concern, was asking questions about criticism, critical theory, and proposing that maybe it's time that we bring the sword of criticism to criticism itself and do a bit of soul searching. And I think my proposal at the moment is that, this is what's required in the arts, some criticism of itself about how it does or does not understand its role outside of its own traditions, outside of its own histories and its own value system that it's created, and understanding its value in terms of its relationship to the world that we live, not as a representation of the world that we live, but as a part of that world. So the art historian and critic Susie Gablik has, a great quote that says, "In Western cultures, artists aren't encouraged to be integral to the social, environmental, or spiritual life of the community. They do not train to engage in real-life problems. Instead, they learn to be competitive in the marketplace with their products." And so, these concepts have made me just think about, and, what I want to do in this next part of this talk is talk about some of the sort of things that I think require discussion in this type of work, some of the conditions or the qualities of this type of practice that I think need to be focused on. And so, a very practical one of these is about how do we prepare artists for working in these sorts of environments. So, in the story I told you about Alder Hey Hospital in Liverpool, I had an experience where I'd been working with the family in intensive care, working with the parents because the child was unconscious in intensive care. And one day I'd agreed to go and meet with them the following day. And that day I was walking through intensive care, and approaching me I saw a doctor, and he stopped and asked me how I was doing. And I told him, I'm just about to go and see this patient in this pod over here. And he sort of casually remarked, "Oh no, he died last night. Anyway, are we on for our 3 o'clock?" And then he walked down the hall, and I stood in this corridor thinking, oh, fuck, I'm not equipped for this. I don't know what to do. And I'm in a professional context, and I'm here as an artist. Everybody's watching me thinking, why is he here? And so this sort of idea of how we equip ourselves for this type of work. The CAD Factory has been doing a lot of work around trying to nurture socially engaged practice and socially engaged artists. Earlier this year in February, we launched at the Archive of New South Wales our new Case Incubator Studios, so a new national hub for the development of socially engaged practice. And we've specifically held this at the Archive of New South Wales to try to infiltrate the institution with this kind of thinking. It took a year to organise this event with the Archive of New South Wales, but, as in lots of institutions, specific staff there were really kind of supportive of the idea. We've also been developing workshop programs for artists to come and engage with, where we have conversations about things like the negotiation of ethics and aesthetics, how we do that, how we deal with the things that we feel within these practices, how we deal with some of the complications of working with non-arts partners. And that includes, just a few months ago, we ran our first Arts and Health mini mentorship. And how that ran was that for 5 days, 3 artists came and participated. On day one, they came to our studio that we have in Sydney. We have a small studio space there, and we sat and we talked about each other's practices, the things that they're interested in developing, the things that trouble them about this type of work. And then for the next 3 days, we went and spent the day with in different spaces. So on the Tuesday, we went to the UNSW's Big Anxiety Research Centre, and so they shared with us the work that they're doing. On the second day, we spent the day with St Vincent's Hospital and looked at their arts and health programs for the day. And then on the third day, we Spent the day with Sydney Children's Hospital, but at a program they run down in La Perouse for single Aboriginal mothers. And so we spent the day there with that group of mothers and their kids, talking with them and sort of being there and understanding our own practices through these experiences. And then on day 5, we came back to the CAD factory to sort of unpick what those days meant. Luckily, we've just received some funding to continue that as an ongoing program, so that's great because we delivered it this year just out of passion because we wanted to do it and we had all the connections, so we thought it would be a really easy thing to kind of achieve. And so this idea of arts and health, over the past decade, there's been a rapid rise in evidence demonstrating the beneficial impacts of integrating the arts into health practices. So, that evidence base includes things like the 2023 Creative Health Review by the UK All-Party Parliamentary Working Group, and the 2019 World Health Organization Scoping Review of over 3,000 studies which identified a major role for the arts in the prevention of ill health, promotion of health and management and treatment of illness across the lifespan. And so in the early stages of my PhD, I was looking at all the amazing work that always talks so positively about the arts and health conferences I've been going to that always speak so positively about the arts. But I was really interested in some of the critiques that exist of it. What's the other side? What are people sort of rejecting or thinking through or questioning? And so in sort of trying to review some of those, I came across, there was 4 kind of critiques that I held with me throughout my PhD and still to this day sort of keep as sort of touchstones in terms of things to be thinking through. And, these have come from the researcher Clift and his response mostly to the World Health Organization's scoping review of 3,000 studies. And so, some of his critiques, or the 4 that I'm going to speak about, are that firstly that any form of participatory activity could have an empowering effect, whether arts-based or not. And so the point of this critique is that, maybe it's not about the arts, maybe it's about the human connection that's happening. Maybe it's about, particularly in a clinical space where people feel they have to be given permission to speak. The surgeon might ask them questions that appear open-ended, but certainly in my experience in my PhD, patients don't talk as if they feel like, oh, I can speak about anything now. They're sort of second-guessing, what does the surgeon want to hear from me? And certainly in the case of facial nerve paralysis, where we're talking about major psychological issues from presenting to the world with facial difference and what that means, whether there is or isn't enough space to talk about that stuff within the clinic. And so, this idea of whether it's just about that human sort of exchange, and, I'd argue in my practice that is a really big part of it. But one of the reasons in my PhD I decided to present my exhibition 1 year before my thesis was due, so that I could also get ethical approval to use the exhibition to collect further data. And so that was about patient responses to the work, clinicians' responses to the work, but also the general public. And the reason I wanted the general public's response to the work captured was because many people with facial nerve paralysis speak about things like social exclusion, how they're treated because of social difference. And so one of the ideas of the exhibition was to place that concept to an audience of other people who would have to sort of grapple with this as a topic. And so, that enabled me to then do some research about what did the art do? What did the art outcomes do for people? And so, there was great sort of outcomes in terms of the patients speaking about the benefits of not only seeing their own experience represented like that, but for them to then go and see the experiences of other patients represented or explored or shown in other art forms. The next critique from Clift that's really relevant, I think, is that little attention to longer-term outcomes. There is little attention to longer-term outcomes as opposed to short-term effects. And I think here he's referring to a lot of those 3,000 research papers in the World Health Organization's review. Look at projects that are for short time frames. They're looking at, well, if we participate in a dance class for a period of time, will we have experiences of pain reduction and therefore a reduction in pain medicine? In terms of that work, I think, my journey in this arts and health or socially engaged practice realm is about long-term change. It's about changing the views of clinicians, and the clinicians about the value and worth of somebody like me being in their space. It's about changing in the long term within the art world, the value of works that are relational, community engaged, socially engaged in terms of legitimate art making. The third critique from Clift is that there's little attention to the artistic or aesthetic quality of cultural and arts engagements in assessing outcomes. And so this, of course, is key to my work constantly. And so this is really referring to the fact that within all of these health research papers, often the only thing that's talked about is the health outcomes. There isn't discussion about the art form, the development of the language of art languages and processes. And really that, in my view, that if we are saying that the research tells us that the arts have all these qualities that we can draw on to aid well-being or aid specific circumstances like facial nerve paralysis, that surely we must also tend to those qualities. We must tend to the qualities of the arts rather than just drawing from them and using them as a tool of instrumentalising them. And so that, again, became sort of a really central part of my thesis. And then finally, in terms of Clift's critiques, is about the focus on the role of the arts and culture may serve as a convenient means to divert attention from the real causes of today's social problems and the tough solutions that might be needed to solve them. And so a really great example of this is I participated in the new curatorial strategy for RPA Hospital in Sydney. So the first time it's ever had such a thing. It's just been approved by the various levels of committee, so it will roll out shortly. And it's a $2.5 million curatorial plan, $2.5 million of commissioning that's about to happen at RPA Hospital. The process of creating that curatorial strategy was that they called it a curatorium, was assembled for 3 meetings, and there was roughly 20 people involved in that. And so it would include the CEO of RPA Hospital and some senior health bureaucrats, but also kind of senior arts world people, so people from the Australia Council, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Powerhouse Museum, Sydney University, and then there was 3 artists invited, and I was one of those artists. In one of those meetings, the institutions around the table were talking about things that they could easily do to assist. So they were talking about we could give discounts to our exhibitions to medical staff at the hospital. So on the weekend, they can take their family and go to the Art Gallery of New South Wales and not pay to get into the major exhibition, for example. It was then brought up that most of those surgeons, for example, work most of the time. And actually that, the thought that they'll actually stop and go and do something like that is negative. And so then they all decide, well, that's a bad idea. Let's think about something else. And I kind of raised my hand and said, is it potentially a good idea then that an arts project could explore the concept that surgeons are so overworked, that we've set up a health system that makes this a norm? And of course, the conversation, particularly with the health bureaucrats in the room, was dismissed very quickly and moved on from. And so, this is at the heart of Clift's critique, that these bigger issues, which I think in the work of the CAD Factory are the issues that we're trying to tackle through some of these works, that in arts and health contexts that sometimes maybe potentially we sort of ignore those. And so there's just time's moving so quickly. I just wanted to, raise a couple of other qualities, those being both discomfort and the unknown, just very briefly. And so, I mentioned in the Arts and Health Mini Mentorship that we spent the day at La Perouse with the program for young Aboriginal single mothers. After that, some of the sort of debriefing that was happened was about how uncomfortable all of the artists felt, thinking they were intruders into this space. What am I doing here? That everybody was white, the artists that went there. They're here as just sort of to observe and view this day. And so these sort of conversations about discomfort. And, when I reflect on my practice, I think very clearly about the period of time in my life that I have been sitting in extreme discomfort and nausea about the sort of experiences that my arts practice is engaging with, and how this sort of navigation of discomfort is something of real value within this type of practice. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's also about how do we keep each other safe when we're sort of exposing ourselves to these sorts of things. And then there's concepts like the unknown. So in the medical clinic, where one thing that clinicians are trying to do is remove all of the unknowns that exist. They're trying to get control of them so they can lead the patient to a positive health outcome. Where, I'd often reflect in my experience at the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic that what I was often grappling with and sitting comfortably with is the unknowns in which the patients are always sitting. So those patients in the facial nerve clinic might recover. They might not recover. They might spend the rest of their life with facial nerve paralysis, or they might die. They're sitting in this constant state of unknown. And so while the clinic is trying to, rightfully so, remove all of those unknowns, one of my roles in the clinic was to sit with them, to sit with the unknown aspects that those patients were experiencing. So I think what I didn't sort of mention, that the way I enacted my PhD was at the clinic when patients would go to be examined by up to 13 clinicians at the same time. So a room full of ear, throat, and nose specialists, eye surgeons, physiotherapists, etc. There was also me as a contemporary artist in that room, and then I would work with patients just like the other specialists would. And so I'm just going to sort of ramp towards my ending by just sharing my own vulnerability in doing this, because I just wanted to sort of share a slippery concept that I'm trying to get a hold of, and I haven't quite got a hold of it yet. And I sort of introduced it in my PhD, and in the Routledge publication, it will be resolved. That's what my Christmas time will be spent doing, resolving this concept. But I just wanted to speak elements of where I'm sort of getting to on it, even though it makes me feel vulnerable. So really it's about, the idea of how we value and measure these things. So, the CAD Factory talks about the concept of numbers, narratives and beyond. And so that meaning that we have this obligation, because we get arts funding, for KPIs, audience numbers, etc., artist engagement. We also have the narratives, so the more qualitative aspects of what we're doing, the stories that emerge. And, even though within the medical faculty there's still even just so much tension realistically exists between those two, the value of those two forms of knowledge production. We also talk about and beyond. What are those other things that sit even beyond the post-qualitative things, maybe, the other sort of elements that sit beyond qualitative research, through which we can understand not just our process but its value or its outcomes. Artists have long been subject to metrics like sales, reviews, audience numbers. Even within paradigms like art for art's sake, there are still the measures around social capital or reputation or mythology that exist for artists. So that sort of concept that, we're measured by something isn't foreign, and I think the idea that we would remove them, it kind of isn't realistic. So the challenge then is to develop approaches that account for aspects such as the material, the affective and the performative qualities of socially engaged art practice, acknowledging these supposedly unquantifiable moments of encounter as being the moments that actually define, shape and measure the process. Therefore, I'm thinking through this idea of the conceptual map, the materiality, affect and performativity, to try to better explore the qualities of socially engaged practice. By acknowledging these qualities, we can construct a cartography to chart the layered terrain or the fluid contours of relational artistic processes and outcomes. In this map of socially engaged practice, we focus on qualities such as the tangible and intangible aspects of materiality, the emotional and psychological or affective dimensions of experience, and the performed witness aspects of human interaction and expression. The Australian environmental philosopher Val Plumwood, her concept of shadow places was introduced as a way to consider the places that we rely on but we don't care for. So for an example, we could draw on our desire for consumption means that a shadow place of that is the rubbish tip. In the cities, people that rely on food and fibre production, one of their shadow places might be the regional places that grow that food and fibre, yet they don't care for those places or have a relationship to them. So Val Plumwood's concept of shadow places, it's often tied up with this sort of idea of geography and resources and dependencies. But the concept here and the relevance of shadow places to me is to expand that as an idea, to propose that the material, affective and performative shadow places that emerge in the residue of everyday life are the entanglements with which socially engaged practice engages. That socially engaged art is not simply focused on addressing issues as external objects in external places to be measured and resolved. Instead, socially engaged art is a practice. That was an early alarm, so I'm wrapping up now. I'm not going to look at you to see if that was correct or not. So I'm not looking at socially engaged practice as something that addresses issues as external objects in external places to be measured and resolved. Instead, socially engaged art is a practice that seeks to unfold the dynamic, transformative interactions across layered terrains such as materiality, affect, and performativity. So the idea of the map of socially engaged practice can be introduced through a simple yet profound example of a teardrop. And my aim is to also have an example of a goosebump, but I don't have that yet. So here is another work that was in my PhD exhibition, and there was two works. Lachlan referred to one around the crying room. There was two works that talked about tears, and these works came about because of the immense number of times I sat in that clinic, witnessed a patient cry, then witnessed them apologise, wipe away their tears and move on from that emotion. Then also the conversations I had with those clinicians who were also my participants, where I would interrogate them about their responses to things like tears in the clinic, and them speaking about things like their fear about being ill-equipped to deal with that, or their viewpoint that, well, that's not what they're there for. They're there for the mechanics of what they're dealing with. But they hope that there's people there that have the skill set to sort of deal with that. And so this work was a lacrimal vase, the idea of the lacrimal vase where you collect a tear when you're in grieving, or a vase where you collect tears. And in this installation, this involved electronics and sculpture. And when a gallery visitor cried a tear onto this lacrimal vase, in hidden speakers in the space, they were told that they were loved. And so it was an idea of sort of valuing the tear. So, in these instances where tears arise, but then they're moved on from, they're apologised for, and they're ignored, this work and sort of this idea of, or trying to use this as an example to try to think through this map of socially engaged practice, is to say that instead of dismissing the tear, we could instead consider its materiality as an expression of the affective journey tended to by the performativity of those who are present, the witnesses. Recognising how the map of socially engaged practice might inform us to witness the qualities present in a teardrop, we can view the teardrop as more than a fleeting moment of vulnerability. Instead, we can recognise it as a materiality of our emotional experience, a residue of contemporary life, and a call to action that arises from human vulnerability. The presence of tears can be seen as an invitation to care, but often, paradoxically, tears can create barriers to the very care that they seek. By paying attention to the significance of the teardrop, we can not only acknowledge the embodied and effective expression of experience contained within, but also challenge ourselves to engage with the discomfort it might provoke. In doing so, we open up a space for deeper relationality to not only be experienced, but to be understood as an essential component of socially engaged practice, holding much potential for knowledge production. The intention of this tearful examination isn't to solely immerse in the emotional potentials of socially engaged art making, but instead to explore how new forms of measurement and understanding might be observed by understanding the qualities exposed within the map of socially engaged practice. I'm not proposing that as a KPI we count tears as a measure, but instead I'm using tears as just one example to illustrate the importance of identifying these material, affective and performative aspects to understand their centrality in shaping the relational, socially engaged methodology, a methodology that is active, alive and in process of change as it unfolds. And so I have 11 more hours to talk about here, but I'm just going to try to wrap that up by saying thank you. I've been using this talk to try to sort of coalesce my thoughts into something and raise some of the questions that I think are in urgent need of discussion around this type of practice. So thank you very much.
Well, I think we can agree that was very well coalesced, very beautifully coalesced. And thank you so much. I'm very inspired by a lot of that. But is there a burning question somebody has?
Thank you so much. That was very inspirational. And my question is, how did you convince doctors and medical examiners to be your supervisor as one, but then also to actually okay this kind of? How did you sell it to them? That's my question, I guess.
Well, the journey of that was, I was giving a talk in Sydney about that work in Alder Hey, and there was one of the founders for the facial nerve clinic happened to be in the audience, and afterwards they came and spoke to me specifically about what they saw as a doctor. They have to create a sense of trust with their patient because their life's in their hands, and how what they got from my talk was the trust that I must have built with Alicia and her family. And so that was her sort of interest. So we were talking, and at that time I'd been considering undertaking a PhD, and she invited me to come and just observe the clinic. And so I went and observed it, and I left thinking, I think my PhD has started, even though I haven't done anything apart from think it. So then I spoke to her, and so really, like all of these things, it depends on key people. So she then went to the head of medical research and spoke about this artist who wants to come. And so she did some of that groundwork. I was able to have really honest conversations saying, doing a PhD is hard enough, but I don't want to come to a place where my history isn't valued. I need there to be a sense that I'm valued in some way. And so they sort of made it very clear to me that they would value me if I did that. And then also she then went and did the work to navigate the facial nerve clinic and I won't open that topic yet because it will go for too long, but the work that had to be done to convince people that, there is a reason for this, which I then took on as my responsibility of thinking, why would they think there was a reason for this? It's actually part of my job now is to show them and explain to them why this is something.
My name's Jessica. I feel like I could ask a billion questions, but I'm interested in where you see writing in relationship to this, because you talked about creative practice and sort of visual arts and sort of sculpture and all that kind of stuff. I'm a writer, and I really love creative non-fiction and memoir, for example, and I'm wondering how, if there's any relationship you see there, especially with the people that are working at the CAD factory. Are there any writers that are part of that practice?
So I think, I have a view that I just call everything artistic practice, so that includes writing. And so, I see those creative activities, hence the invitation to Lachlan. We invited, say, Chris Abrahams, a piano player from the Australian band The Necks, came and made work in response to that, and that was no different to me in my world. I understand it's a different discipline, but in terms of that, so that's the first overarching comment that I'd make. But and the CAD factory sort of expands and contracts for various projects. So sometimes we bring in other artists, and that in the past has included writers, and that might be about embedding those writers in communities to explore something, or it might be those artists writing in response to some other sort of part of work we're making in really different kind of ways. I think what we're mostly interested in is artists who just want to push that type of their practice and to understand it, even if they're not sure what that means yet or how to do it. We're trying to also create a nurturing environment to go, let's push things, let's push practice gently for ourselves, but, to understand where it sits. Where can writing sit, for example? So, yes, I very much see that as having a place.